April 29th, 1945. Dachau, Germany. The air smells of ash and rot. A woman sits on the edge of a wooden bunk, her hands trembling as they grip a small pencil stub. It is no longer than her thumb. The paper before her is torn from a discarded ration box, wrinkled and stained. She stares at it as if it were a mirror she hasn't seen in years. Around her, the barracks hum with whispers. Women move slowly, their bodies thin as shadows, their eyes wide with disbelief. Outside, American soldiers stand in the spring sunlight, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces pale with shock. One of them had handed her the pencil. "You can write," he said. "You can keep it." She didn't understand at first. Write what? Keep what? For 3 years, she had been a number, a body, a thing without a name. To write was to exist, to remember, to be human again. Her hand hovers over the paper. Then, slowly, she begins. The first word is her name. To understand the weight of that pencil, you must first understand what had been taken away. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany had operated a vast network of concentration camps, labor camps, and extermination centers across occupied Europe for over a decade. These were not merely prisons. They were systems designed to erase identity, crush the human spirit, and reduce entire populations to numbers tattooed on skin. Women were among the most vulnerable. They were sent to camps like Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in the Reich, located 50 miles north of Berlin. Opened in May 1939, Ravensbrück held over 130,000 women and children throughout the war. They came from across Europe, Polish resistance fighters, French political prisoners, Jewish mothers, Romani women, Jehovah's Witnesses, lesbians, and those labeled asocial by the Nazi state. Inside these camps, identity was systematically destroyed. Names were replaced with numbers, hair was shaved, clothing was stripped and replaced with coarse striped uniforms or mismatched rags. Personal belongings, photographs, letters, jewelry, anything that connected a prisoner to her former life, were confiscated upon arrival. To possess a diary, a scrap of paper with a name written on it, or even a hidden photograph, was a crime punishable by beating, solitary confinement, or death. The Nazis understood the power of memory. They knew that to control a person's past was to control their future. Documentation was forbidden because documentation was resistance. It was proof. It was witness. Women who tried to write were caught and punished. In Ravensbrück, guards conducted frequent searches of barracks, tearing apart bunks, ripping open mattresses, searching bodies. Any scrap of paper, any hidden pencil, was evidence of defiance. Some women scratched messages into walls with stones. Others memorized poems, prayers, and the names of the dead, repeating them silently each night so they would not be forgotten. But by early 1945, the Nazi Empire was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Western Allies were pushing through Germany from the west. As Soviet forces neared camps like Auschwitz in January 1945, the SS began evacuating prisoners on brutal death marches, forcing tens of thousands to walk hundreds of miles in freezing winter conditions. Thousands died on the roads. In the chaos, some camps were abandoned, others were hastily destroyed, evidence burned, records erased. The Nazis knew what was coming. They knew the world would see what they had done. American forces entered Germany in March 1945. They had been briefed on the existence of camps, but nothing prepared them for what they found. On April 4, 1945, the U.S. 4th Armored Division liberated Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of Buchenwald. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited days later. He walked through the barracks, saw the bodies stacked like firewood, and ordered every nearby German civilian to tour the camp. He wanted them to see. He wanted the world to see. "The things I saw beggar description," Eisenhower wrote. "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. He ordered that everything be documented. Photographers, journalists, and film crews were brought in. This was not just liberation. This was evidence. On April 11th, the U.S. 6th Armored Division reached Buchenwald. On April 15, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen, where Anne Frank had died just weeks earlier. On April 29, the U.S. 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions arrived at Dachau, one of the oldest and most infamous camps in the Nazi system. Dachau had been opened in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power. It was the model for all other camps. Over 200,000 people passed through its gates. More than 41,000 died there. When American soldiers entered Dachau on that spring morning, they found over 30,000 prisoners still alive. Barely. The camp was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and littered with corpses. Rail cars sat on the tracks outside, filled with the bodies of prisoners who had been transported from other camps and left to die. The soldiers were young men, many of them barely 20 years old. They had fought across Europe, seen combat, lost friends. But nothing had prepared them for this. Some vomited, some wept. Some stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. And among the living, thousands of women stared back at them, skeletal, hollow-eyed, unable to believe that liberation had finally come. The women who survived to see liberation had endured years of calculated dehumanization. In camps like Ravensbrück, daily life was designed to break the will. Prisoners woke before dawn to the sound of whistles and shouting. Roll call or appel could last for hours in freezing cold or scorching heat. Women stood in rows, motionless, while guards counted and recounted, sometimes punishing the entire block if a single person moved or fainted. Work was brutal and endless. Women were forced into slave labor, sewing uniforms for the Wehrmacht, assembling munitions, building roads, clearing rubble. Some were sent to sub-camps attached to factories owned by German corporations like Siemens, which profited directly from their suffering. Others were subjected to medical experiments. At Ravensbrück, Dr. Karl Gebhardt conducted surgical experiments on young Polish women, deliberately infecting wounds to test sulfonamide drugs. The victims were called rabbits by other prisoners because of the way they limped after surgery. Food was starvation rations. A typical daily meal consisted of watery soup, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a sliver of margarine or sausage. Calories rarely exceeded 1,000 per day, far below what the body needed to survive hard labor. Women grew skeletal. Their periods stopped. Their teeth fell out. Their hair thinned and their skin turned gray. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and typhoid fever swept through overcrowded barracks where women slept 3 or 4 to a bunk on wooden slats with no mattresses. Latrines overflowed. Water was contaminated. Medical care was non-existent unless a prisoner was deemed useful enough to save. And through it all, the SS maintained absolute control through terror. Punishments were public and brutal. Women were whipped, hung by their wrists, locked in standing cells so narrow they could not sit, or sent to the Strafblock, the punishment barracks, where survival was measured in days. Executions were routine. Some women were shot, others were gassed in small chambers or sent to extermination centers like Auschwitz-Birkenau. But even in this hell, women resisted. They resisted by sharing food, by singing quietly at night, by teaching each other languages, poems, and prayers, by hiding the sick during roll call so they wouldn't be selected for death, by remembering birthdays, by refusing to forget their names, and some resisted by writing. In secret, in the dark, women scratched words onto scraps of paper, cloth, or wood. They wrote letters they could never send. They recorded the names of the dead. They documented atrocities, knowing they might not survive to tell the story themselves, but hoping someone would find their words. One woman at Ravensbrück, a French resistance fighter named Germaine Tillion, memorized entire lists of deportations and deaths, later reconstructing them from memory after liberation. Another, a Polish prisoner named Wanda Potowska, kept mental notes of the medical experiments, which she later testified about at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. These acts of memory were acts of defiance. The Nazis wanted to erase them. The women refused to be erased. But by April 1945, many had lost hope that anyone would ever know. The camps were isolated. Communication with the outside world had been severed. Families had been scattered or murdered. The women had no idea if the Allies even knew they existed. Some believed they would be killed before liberation ever came. Others feared the SS would blow up the camps, destroying all evidence and everyone inside. Then the Americans arrived. The liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, was chaotic and violent. American soldiers, enraged by what they saw, killed dozens of SS guards on the spot. Some prisoners joined in, beating guards to death with shovels and stones. The camp descended into a brief, bloody reckoning. But once the initial shock subsided, the Americans began the work of relief. Medics moved through the barracks, treating the sick and dying. Kitchens were set up to provide food, though many prisoners were too weak to eat solid meals and had to be fed carefully to avoid refeeding syndrome, which could be fatal. Photographers and journalists documented everything the world needed to see. And in the midst of this, something unexpected happened. American soldiers began handing out paper and pencils. Some did it instinctively, wanting to help prisoners contact surviving family members. Others did it because they had been ordered to collect testimonies for war crimes investigations. But for the women who received them, the gesture carried a meaning far deeper than practicality. For years, they had been forbidden to write, forbidden to remember, forbidden to exist as individuals. Now, an American soldier was handing them the tools to reclaim their voices. Many women stared at the paper in disbelief. Some wept. Others clutched the pencils as if they were sacred objects. A few began writing immediately, their hands shaking, tears falling onto the pages. They wrote their names, their hometowns, the names of their children, the dates they were arrested, the friends who had died beside them. They wrote because they could, because they were allowed, because for the first time in years, someone believed their words mattered. For the women who had survived the camps, the act of writing was not simply about recording events. It was about reclaiming selfhood. Psychologists who later studied Holocaust survivors identified a phenomenon they called identity dissolution, the systematic destruction of a person's sense of self through dehumanization, depersonalization, and the erasure of individual history. In the camps, prisoners were stripped of their names and called by numbers. They were told repeatedly that they were worthless, that no one was coming for them, that they would die and be forgotten. This psychological assault was as deliberate as the physical violence. The Nazis understood that to control a population, you must first convince them they are not human. When American soldiers handed women paper and pencils, they were offering more than tools. They were offering recognition. The message was clear. You are a person. Your story matters. You have the right to remember. For many women, this was the first time in years that anyone had treated them as individuals. Some could barely speak. Others had forgotten how to write, their hands too weak or their minds too traumatized to form letters. But the act itself, the permission to try, was transformative. One survivor later recalled, "When the American gave me the pencil, I held it and cried. I didn't know what to write. I had forgotten my own handwriting, but I knew I had to write something, anything, to prove I was still alive." The American soldiers who liberated the camps were not trained for what they encountered. Most were infantrymen, tankers, and medics. Young men from small towns and cities across the United States who had enlisted to fight a war, not to witness genocide. When they entered Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps, many were overcome with rage, grief, and helplessness. Some shot SS guards on sight. Others broke down in tears. A few could not bring themselves to enter the barracks. But many also felt a profound need to do something, anything, to help. Handing out paper and pencils was one of the few tangible acts of kindness they could offer. Food had to be rationed carefully to avoid killing prisoners through refeeding. Medical supplies were limited, but paper and pencils were available, carried in packs or requisitioned from nearby towns. Some soldiers gave out their own notebooks, tearing out pages and distributing them. Others went into abandoned German homes and offices, gathering stationery, pens, and journals. They did this without orders, driven by instinct and compassion. One soldier from the 42nd Infantry Division later wrote in his diary, "I gave a woman a pencil and a piece of paper. She looked at me like I'd given her the world. I don't know what she wrote, but she held that pencil like it was made of gold. For the soldiers, these small acts were a way to restore humanity, not just for the prisoners, but for themselves. In the face of unimaginable horror, giving someone the ability to write their own name was a way to affirm that goodness still existed. The Nazis had always feared the written word. From the earliest days of the Third Reich, they burned books, censored newspapers, and controlled all forms of communication. In the camps, this control was absolute. Prisoners were forbidden from possessing paper, pens, or any means of recording their experiences. Guards conducted regular searches, and anyone caught with contraband faced severe punishment. This was not arbitrary cruelty. It was strategic. The Nazis knew that documentation was evidence. If prisoners could write, they could bear witness. They could name names, record dates, describe atrocities. They could create a historical record that would outlast the Reich. So the SS destroyed records, burned files, and executed prisoners who might testify. As the war turned against Germany, this effort intensified. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the SS blew up gas chambers and crematoria, attempting to erase all physical evidence of mass murder. Thousands of documents were burned. But they could not destroy memory. Women who survived did so, in part, because they remembered. They memorized the names of the dead. They recounted stories to each other, repeating them like prayers so they would not be lost. They became living archives. When the Americans allowed them to write, they were undoing the Nazi project of erasure. Every name written down, every testimony recorded, was a defeat for the system that had tried to make them disappear. Throughout history, diaries have been tools of resistance. Anne Frank's diary, written in hiding in Amsterdam, became one of the most powerful testimonies of the Holocaust. But she was not alone. Across occupied Europe, Jews and other persecuted groups kept secret diaries, knowing they might not survive, but hoping their words would. In the camps, keeping a diary was nearly impossible and extraordinarily dangerous. But some women tried. At Ravensbrück, a group of French women smuggled scraps of paper and pencil stubs into the barracks. They wrote in tiny script, hiding the pages in the linings of their clothes or burying them in the ground. One woman, Germaine Tillion, later published her notes as a book, Ravensbrück, an eyewitness account of a women's concentration camp. These diaries were not just personal records. They were acts of defiance. To write was to assert that the truth mattered, that history would judge, that the world would one day know. When liberation came, and American soldiers handed out paper freely, the women understood the significance. For the first time, they could write without fear. They could document openly. They could reclaim their voices. One survivor wrote in her first diary entry after liberation, "I am alive. I have a name. I will not be forgotten." The diaries and testimonies written by female survivors in the days and weeks following liberation became critical evidence in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, relied heavily on documentation. The Allies needed proof, not just of the camp's existence, but of the systematic nature of the crimes, the chain of command, and the individual responsibility of Nazi leaders and guards. Women's testimonies provided that proof. According to records from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, female survivors gave thousands of written and oral testimonies in the months following liberation. These accounts detailed specific atrocities, the names of guards who committed murders, the dates of mass executions, the conditions of medical experiments, and the deliberate starvation policies. At the Ravensbrück trial, held in Hamburg in 1946-1947, 16 defendants were prosecuted for crimes committed at the women's camp. The prosecution relied heavily on survivor testimonies. Women who had been imprisoned there took the stand and described the beatings, the gas chamber that had been installed in early 1945, and the selections that sent thousands to their deaths. One survivor, Violette Lecoq, a French resistance fighter, testified about the execution of women by shooting and gassing. Her testimony, along with written statements from other survivors, helped convict Camp Commandant Fritz Surin and Chief Guard Dorothea Binz, both of whom were sentenced to death. The diaries that women began writing immediately after liberation served as raw, unfiltered evidence. Unlike testimonies given months or years later, these early writings captured the immediacy of trauma, the names and details still fresh in memory. Prosecutors used them to corroborate other evidence and to establish timelines. Dr. Wanda Potawska, a Polish survivor of Ravensbrück who had been subjected to medical experiments, kept detailed mental notes throughout her imprisonment. After liberation, she wrote everything down. Her testimony was later used in the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946-1947, which prosecuted Nazi physicians for crimes against humanity. The act of writing, which had been forbidden under Nazi rule, became an instrument of justice. For many of the women, writing was not just about legal testimony or historical record. It was about preserving memory as a sacred duty. In Jewish tradition, memory is central to identity. The Torah commands, "Remember the days of old, consider the generations long past." Deuteronomy 32:7. Throughout the Holocaust, Jews risked their lives to preserve memory, burying documents, memorizing prayers, and recording the names of the dead. In the camps, women recited Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, even when they had no prayer books. They remembered Yahrzeits, the anniversaries of loved ones' deaths. They whispered the names of children who had been taken from them, repeating them so they would not be forgotten. When liberation came, the ability to write these names down was profoundly meaningful. It was a way to honor the dead, to fulfill the obligation of memory, and to ensure that those who had perished would not vanish from history. One survivor, Fania Fenlong, a French Jewish cabaret singer who had been forced to perform in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, later wrote, "We had to remember. It was our duty to the dead. If we forgot them, they would die a second time." Non-Jewish women also felt this duty. Polish political prisoners, Romani women, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others who had been persecuted wrote down the names of friends and fellow prisoners who had died. They documented the dates, the causes, the circumstances. They created makeshift memorials in ink and paper. According to historian Sarah Helm, who interviewed dozens of Ravensbrück survivors for her book, many women described writing as a form of prayer. "It was how we kept them alive," one survivor told her. "By writing their names, we made sure they existed." This spiritual dimension of writing gave the act a weight beyond documentation. It was an assertion that every life mattered, that every death deserved to be mourned, and that memory itself was an act of resistance against oblivion. The moment came quietly, without ceremony. It was not a single event, but thousands of small moments happening across liberated camps in the spring of 1945. A soldier handing a woman a pencil, a nurse tearing pages from a notebook, a chaplain distributing prayer books with blank pages in the back. At Dachau, in the days following April 29th, American medics and relief workers moved through the barracks with clipboards, recording names and nationalities. They needed to identify survivors, locate families, and begin the process of repatriation. But they quickly realized that many women could barely speak. Trauma, illness, and years of silence had stolen their voices. So they gave them paper instead. One woman, a Polish Jew named Hadassah Rosensaft, later described the moment in her testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation. She had been transferred to Bergen-Belsen before its liberation by British forces on April 15, 1945. When a British soldier handed her a pencil and a scrap of paper, she stared at it for a long time. "I didn't know what to write," she said. "I had so much to say, but I couldn't find the words, so I wrote my name, just my name, and then I wrote my mother's name, and my sister's name, and I kept writing names until the paper was full." At Ravensbrück, which had been evacuated by the SS in late April, the Red Cross and Swedish rescue missions arrived to find thousands of women still alive, many too sick to move. French survivor Germaine Tillion, who had been liberated in a Red Cross convoy, immediately began writing. She filled page after page with names, dates, and descriptions of what had happened in the camp. "I was terrified I would forget," she later wrote. "I had spent years memorizing everything, the transports, the executions, the experiments. Now I had paper, and I wrote for days without stopping. I wrote until my hand cramped and I couldn't hold the pen anymore. At Mauthausen, liberated by the U.S. 11th Armored Division on May 5, 1945, a group of Spanish Republican women who had been imprisoned since 1940 gathered in a barracks and began writing a collective testimony. They passed a single notebook between them, each woman adding her story. They wrote in Spanish, French, and broken German, filling the pages with accounts of forced labor, beatings, and the deaths of friends. One of them, Neus Catala, later published her memoir based on those early writings. She described the act of writing as a kind of resurrection. "We had been ghosts," she wrote. "Writing made us real again." But not all women could write. Some were too weak, others were illiterate, or had forgotten how to read and write after years of deprivation. For them, the Americans provided scribes, soldiers, nurses, or other survivors who could write on their behalf. At Dachau, a U.S. Army chaplain named Rabbi David Max Eichhorn spent weeks interviewing survivors and recording their testimonies. He carried a notebook everywhere, writing down names, stories, and prayers. He later published a book, Musings of the Old Professor, in which he described the urgency the women felt to be heard. "They grabbed my arm," he wrote. "They pulled me into the barracks. They spoke in Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, languages I didn't understand, but I understood their need. They needed someone to listen. They needed someone to write it down." The act of writing became a ritual of liberation. In some camps, women gathered in groups, reading their entries aloud to each other. They wept as they listened. They corrected details, added memories, and filled in gaps. They were reconstructing their own history, piece by piece. At Bergen-Belsen, a group of Jewish women held a makeshift memorial service in late April, just days after liberation. They had no Torah, no prayer books, but they had paper. Each woman wrote the name of a loved one who had died, and they buried the papers in the ground, creating a symbolic grave. One survivor, Anita Lasker-Wallfish, a cellist who had been forced to play in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, later described the moment, "We had no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, but we had names, and we buried the names. It was all we could do." The diaries became more than personal records. They became collective memory, shared testimony, and proof of survival. And as the women wrote, something else began to happen. They began to remember not just the horror, but the humanity. They wrote about friendships formed in the camps, about acts of kindness, a piece of bread shared, a song sung in the dark, a hand held during roll call. They wrote about the women who had saved their lives, and the women they had tried to save. One survivor, a French political prisoner named Charlotte Delbo, later wrote a series of prose poems based on her memories of Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. In one, she described the act of writing as a way to honor the dead. "I write because they cannot. I write because I promised them I would. I write because if I do not, they will have died for nothing." The diaries were not just about the past. They were about the future. They were a way of saying, "This happened. We were here. We survived. And the world must never forget." As the days passed, the diaries evolved. What began as simple lists of names and dates grew into detailed narratives. Women who had been too traumatized to speak found their voices on paper. They wrote about their arrests, their journeys to the camps, the faces of guards, the sounds of trains, the smell of smoke. They wrote about the children. At Ravensbrück, thousands of children had been imprisoned alongside their mothers. Some were born in the camp. Others were brought there as infants or toddlers. Many did not survive. The women who had watched them die now wrote their names, their ages, the dates they had perished. One Polish survivor, Stanisława Leszczyńska, a midwife who had delivered over 3,000 babies in Auschwitz, began documenting every birth she could remember after liberation. She wrote in a small notebook, filling page after page with names, birth dates, and the fates of the infants. Most had been killed by the SS or died from starvation and disease, but she remembered them all. "I made a promise to every mother," she later said. "I promised I would remember their babies. I would say their names. I would tell the world they existed." At Bergen-Belsen, a Dutch Jewish woman named Hetty Verelme, who had been a child prisoner, wrote about the other children she had known. She described how they had tried to stay human, playing games with pebbles, singing songs, telling each other stories. She wrote about the girl who had shared her last piece of bread, and the boy who had died in her arms. The act of writing these memories was excruciating. Many women wept as they wrote. Some had to stop, unable to continue. Others wrote compulsively, as if afraid that if they paused, the memories would slip away. But they kept writing. Because the Americans had told them they could, because someone was listening, because for the first time, their words had power. The U.S. military understood the importance of these testimonies. General Eisenhower had ordered comprehensive documentation of the camps, not just for historical record, but for legal prosecution. The Judge Advocate General's office began collecting survivor statements as evidence for future war crimes trials. At Dachau, a war crimes investigation team was established within days of liberation. Officers interviewed survivors, took photographs, and gathered physical evidence. They also collected written testimonies, diaries, letters, and statements written by prisoners in their own hands. According to records from the National Archives, over 2,000 written testimonies were collected from Dachau survivors in the first month after liberation. These documents were later used in the Dachau trials, a series of military tribunals held between 1945 and 1948 that prosecuted guards, administrators, and doctors who had worked at the camp. The women who wrote these testimonies understood their significance. They were not just telling their own stories, they were bearing witness for those who could no longer speak. One survivor, a Hungarian Jewish woman named Gisela Perel, who had been a gynecologist forced to work in the Auschwitz infirmary, wrote a detailed account of the medical atrocities she had witnessed. She described how Dr. Joseph Mengele had conducted experiments on pregnant women, how newborns had been killed, how she had been forced to perform abortions to save women from being sent to the gas chambers. Her testimony was later used in the Nuremberg doctor's trial. She wrote, "I am writing this because the world must know. Not just what happened, but who did it, their names, their faces, their crimes. They must be held accountable." The diaries also became a way for women to process their trauma. Psychologists who later studied Holocaust survivors noted that writing could be therapeutic, a way to externalize pain, to create narrative structure from chaos, to regain a sense of control. But in 1945, there was no formal trauma therapy. The women wrote instinctively, driven by need. Some wrote letters to family members they hoped were still alive. They addressed mothers, fathers, husbands, children, not knowing if they would ever be read. They wrote about their love, their grief, their hope that somehow, somewhere, their loved ones had survived. At Mauthausen, a group of French women wrote a collective letter to the families of those who had died. They listed names, described final moments, and offered what comfort they could. "Your daughter was brave," they wrote. "She did not suffer long. She spoke of you at the end." These letters were carried by Red Cross workers, military chaplains, and relief organizations. Some reached their destinations, many did not. But the act of writing them mattered. It was a way of maintaining connection, of refusing to let death sever the bonds of love. And then there were the women who wrote for themselves. They wrote about who they had been before the war, their jobs, their hobbies, their dreams. They wrote about the lives they wanted to rebuild. They wrote about food they wanted to eat, places they wanted to see, people they wanted to become. One young Polish woman, liberated from a sub-camp of Auschwitz, wrote in her diary, "I want to go to university. I want to study medicine. I want to help people. I want to live in a world where no one is ever treated the way we were treated. I don't know if that world is possible, but I will try to build it." The diaries were acts of defiance, acts of memory, and acts of hope. They were proof that the women had survived, not just physically, but spiritually. That they had retained their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. That they could still dream, still love, still believe in a future. And they were proof that the Nazis had failed. They had tried to erase these women, to reduce them to numbers, to ash, to silence. But the women had written their names, and in doing so, they had won. The diaries did not end with liberation. In the weeks and months that followed, as survivors were moved to displaced persons camps, hospitals, and repatriation centers, they continued to write. The act had become essential, a way to process the unimaginable, to maintain identity, and to ensure that what had happened would never be forgotten. By May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered. But for the survivors, liberation was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. Many were too ill to travel. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery continued to kill survivors even after the camps were liberated. At Bergen-Belsen, approximately 14,000 people died in the weeks following liberation, despite the efforts of British medical teams. At Dachau, American medics worked around the clock to treat the sick. Field hospitals were established. Food was carefully rationed to prevent refeeding syndrome, a condition that could be fatal for severely malnourished prisoners. Clean water, clothing, and medical supplies were brought in. But physical recovery was only part of the challenge. The psychological wounds were deep and invisible. Many survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares. They startled at loud noises. They could not trust easily. Some could not speak about what had happened. Others could not stop speaking about it. The diaries became a lifeline. Women who could not talk to doctors or social workers could write. They poured their trauma onto the page, the nightmares, the guilt of survival, the grief for those who had not made it. They wrote about the difficulty of returning to a world that had continued without them, a world that could not understand what they had endured. One survivor, a French Jewish woman named Simone Veil, who had been deported to Auschwitz at age 16, later wrote about the isolation she felt after liberation. "No one wanted to hear," she said. "People were tired of war. They wanted to move on. But we could not move on. We were still there, in the camps, in our minds." Veil kept a diary throughout her recovery. She wrote about her struggle to reconnect with her surviving family, her return to school, and her determination to rebuild her life. She later became a lawyer, a politician, and a champion of Holocaust remembrance, serving as president of the European Parliament. Her diary, she said, had saved her. "It gave me a place to put the pain," she wrote. "It kept me from drowning in it." The diaries also became tools for reunification. The International Tracing Service, established by the Allies in 1945, worked to locate missing persons and reunite families. Survivors submitted written statements describing their imprisonment, the people they had been with, and the relatives they were searching for. These statements were compiled into massive archives, cross-referenced, and used to trace the fates of millions. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the International Tracing Service collected over 30 million documents related to Holocaust victims and survivors. Many of these were handwritten testimonies submitted in the months following liberation. Women used their diaries to search for loved ones. They wrote letters to relief organizations, listing the names of family members and asking if anyone had seen them. Some received replies, many did not. One Polish Jewish woman, liberated from Ravensbrück, wrote in her diary, "I have written to every organization I can find. I have given them my mother's name, my sister's name, my brother's name. No one has heard from them. I do not know if they are alive or dead. I do not know if I will ever know." The uncertainty was agonizing. Some survivors spent years searching, clinging to hope. Others eventually accepted that their families were gone. But the diaries preserved the memory of those who had been lost. Women wrote detailed descriptions of their relatives, what they looked like, how they spoke, the things they loved. They wrote about their last moments together, the promises they had made, the words they wished they had said. These entries became memorials. They ensured that even if the dead had no graves, they had names, they had stories, they had been loved. The diaries also played a critical role in the prosecution of war criminals. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, were the most significant legal proceedings in history. 24 major Nazi leaders were indicted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The prosecution presented thousands of documents, photographs, and testimonies as evidence. Survivor diaries were among the most powerful pieces of evidence. At the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, held in Jerusalem, dozens of Holocaust survivors testified. Many brought their diaries with them, reading from entries they had written in the days after liberation. Their words, raw and immediate, conveyed the horror in a way that no second-hand account could. One survivor, a Hungarian Jewish woman named Vera Alexander, testified about her time in Auschwitz. She read from her diary, describing the selections, the gas chambers, and the crematoria. Her voice shook as she read, but she did not stop. "I wrote this so the world would know," she said, "and now the world is listening." The diaries also influenced public understanding of the Holocaust. In 1947, the diary of Anne Frank was published in Dutch. It became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages. Anne's voice, young, hopeful, deeply human, brought the Holocaust into the homes of millions of people who had never experienced it. But Anne's diary was not unique. Thousands of women had written similar accounts. Some were published, most were not. But they existed, preserved in archives and family collections, in the hands of survivors who carried them for the rest of their lives. These diaries became part of the historical record. Scholars, historians, and educators used them to teach future generations about the Holocaust. They provided first-hand accounts that could not be disputed, names that could not be erased, voices that could not be silenced. As the years passed, the diaries took on new meanings. For the women who had written them, they became artifacts of survival, physical proof that they had endured, that they had borne witness, that they had refused to be erased. Some survivors kept their diaries private, locked away in drawers or hidden in attics. They could not bear to read them. The memories were too painful, the trauma too fresh. But they could not destroy them either. The diaries were sacred objects, repositories of truth that had to be preserved. Others shared their diaries with their children and grandchildren. They wanted the next generation to know what had happened, to understand the cost of hatred and indifference, to carry the memory forward. One survivor, a Polish Jewish woman named Fela Warszaw, gave her diary to her daughter in the 1970s. "I never spoke about the camps," she said. "I couldn't, but I wanted her to know, so I gave her my diary. I told her, 'Read this, and you will understand who I am.'" The diaries also became teaching tools. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Holocaust education became more widespread, educators began using survivor testimonies in classrooms. Students read excerpts from diaries, watched video testimonies, and met survivors in person. The diaries made history personal. They gave faces and names to the 6 million Jews who had been murdered, and to the millions of others who had been persecuted. According to the USC Shoah Foundation, founded by filmmaker Steven Spielberg in 1994, over 55,000 video testimonies of Holocaust survivors have been recorded and archived. Many of these survivors brought their original diaries to the interviews, reading from them on camera, ensuring that their words would be preserved for future generations. The diaries also influenced literature, film, and art. Writers like Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, and Tadeusz Borowski drew on their own experiences and the testimonies of others to create works that explored the moral and philosophical dimensions of the Holocaust. Their books, If This Is a Man, Night, and This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, became essential texts in Holocaust literature. Filmmakers used survivor testimonies to create documentaries and narrative films. Claude Lanzmann's 9-hour documentary Shoah, 1985, consisted entirely of survivor interviews with no archival footage. The film was a monumental act of memory, allowing survivors to speak in their own words, at length, without interruption. Artists created visual representations of the Holocaust based on survivor accounts. Anselm Kiefer, a German painter, incorporated ash, straw, and lead into his works, evoking the destruction and loss. His paintings were haunted by the testimonies he had read, the diaries he had studied. The diaries had become part of the cultural memory of the Holocaust. They were no longer just personal documents. They were collective inheritance. But the act of writing did not end with the first generation of survivors. Children of survivors, often called the second generation, also wrote. They wrote about growing up in the shadow of trauma, about parents who could not speak of the past, about the weight of inherited memory. They wrote about the nightmares their parents had, the numbers tattooed on their arms, the silences that filled their homes. One second-generation writer, Art Spiegelman, created the graphic novel Mouse, 1991. Based on his father's testimony as an Auschwitz survivor, the book used the medium of comics to explore the complexities of memory, trauma, and the relationship between survivor and child. It won the Pulitzer Prize and became one of the most influential works of Holocaust literature. The third generation, grandchildren of survivors, also began to write and create. They conducted oral history projects, digitized family archives, and used social media to share their grandparents' stories. They understood that the generation of survivors was aging, that soon there would be no living witnesses left, and that the responsibility of memory would fall to them. Organizations like Yad Vashem in Israel, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland worked to preserve survivor testimonies and diaries. They digitized documents, created online archives, and made them accessible to researchers and the public. According to Yad Vashem, the institution holds over 200,000 survivor testimonies in its archives, including thousands of handwritten diaries and letters. These archives ensured that the diaries would outlast the survivors themselves, that the words written in the spring of 1945, in the chaos and relief of liberation, would continue to speak to future generations. But the diaries also raise difficult questions. How do we remember trauma? How do we honor the dead without exploiting their suffering? How do we teach the Holocaust in a way that is both truthful and bearable? Some survivors worried that their testimonies would be misunderstood, sensationalized, or used for political purposes. They worried that the world would focus on the horror and miss the humanity, the acts of kindness, the moments of resistance, the refusal to surrender hope. Others worried that the world would forget, that as the survivors died, the memory would fade, that future generations would doubt, deny, or distort what had happened. These fears were not unfounded. Holocaust denial and distortion have persisted, despite overwhelming evidence. Anti-Semitism has resurged in many parts of the world. Genocide has continued in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and elsewhere. But the diaries remain. They are evidence. They are testimony. They are memory made tangible. And they are a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can endure. That even when everything is taken away, home, family, freedom, dignity, the act of writing a name, of telling a story, of bearing witness is an act of resistance. The women who wrote those first entries in the spring of 1945 could not have known the impact their words would have. They wrote because they had to, because they had been given permission, because someone had handed them a pencil and said, "You matter. Your story matters." And in doing so, they ensured that the world would never forget. There is a photograph taken at Dachau in May 1945. A woman sits on a wooden bunk, her body thin, her face gaunt. In her hands, she holds a small notebook. Her eyes are closed. She is writing. The photograph does not tell us her name. It does not tell us what she is writing, or whether she survived long enough to finish. But it tells us something essential about the human spirit. It tells us that even after years of dehumanization, even after being stripped of everything, name, home, family, dignity, the need to remember, to speak, to exist as an individual, remains. The act of writing is one of the oldest forms of resistance. It is how we claim our place in history. It is how we say, "I was here. I mattered. I will not be forgotten." When American soldiers handed pencils and paper to the women of Dachau, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, and countless other camps, they were offering more than tools. They were offering recognition. They were saying, "You are human. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your story deserves to be told." For the women who received those pencils, the act of writing was transformative. It was a return to selfhood, a reclaiming of identity, a refusal to let the past be erased. Their diaries became evidence in war crimes trials. They became historical records that shaped our understanding of the Holocaust. They became teaching tools that educated generations. They became literature, art, and memory. But most importantly, they became proof that the Nazis had failed. They had tried to reduce millions of people to numbers, to ash, to silence. But the survivors wrote their names, they told their stories, they bore witness, and in doing so, they ensured that the dead would not be forgotten, that the truth would not be buried, and that the world would be forced to reckon with what had been done. The diaries remind us that memory is not passive, it is an act. It requires effort, courage, and commitment. It requires us to listen, to learn, and to carry the stories forward. As the last survivors pass away, the responsibility falls to us, to preserve their words, to honor their memory, to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten. Because the moment we stop remembering is the moment we risk repeating. The woman in the photograph is still writing. Her hand moves across the page, forming words we cannot see. But we know what she is doing. She is bearing witness. She is reclaiming her humanity. She is refusing to be erased. And her words, like the words of thousands of other women, will endure long after the camps have crumbled, long after the last survivor has died, long after we are gone, because she wrote them down, and someone listened.